and welcome everyone to our Measuring Outcomes webinar. GPLH is so glad to have you all. We have a terrific speaker today. You know what, Nora? I don't know how to pronounce your last name.
Phelan.
Phelan, Nora Phelan, a recent graduate of Leadership Westchester. She's a research associate of Measurement Incorporated and has many years experience doing program evaluation. She is the kind of person you would bring in to be your outside evaluator. And I thought that would be a great perspective for us to see what an outside evaluator looks for and how she sets things up. She has experience with primary and secondary education, evaluating programs, out of school time, teacher development, college access, juvenile justice, foster care, mental health, and affordable housing. Prior, she was an internal evaluator as well. And one of the things she's also very experienced at is data visualization. And I think you're going to see that from slide one, that we're going to have some great graphics, and Nora's very skilled at using graphics to communicate. So with that, Nora, take it away. We're so glad you're here.
Thank you, Allison. Welcome, everybody. Thank you all for joining the webinar today. Thank you for the introduction. So I'm Nora Phelan. As Allison said, I've been working in evaluation for about 16 years. I was first an internal evaluator in several different nonprofits, both large and small. And then now I work for Measurement Incorporated. So I'm an external evaluator. We contract with nonprofits, school districts, government entities, both in the New York area and across the country. So today we're going to be talking about measuring outcomes and take a look at the agenda. So we're going to start with why do we measure outcomes? Just make sure that we're clear about the why before we get into the how. Then I want to talk about integrating evaluation and grant writing. So kind of look at the ideal way that we can bring these two areas together. Then we'll get into the real heart of it with designing goals, look at some guidelines and review some examples from different program areas. I want to talk a little bit about measurement tools and data collection systems, which I was just going to touch on this because I wasn't sure how much this type of work overlapped with what you all do, although in the networking, just the last few minutes, I am hearing that people are dealing with spreadsheets and things, so that sounds like that is relevant for some of you. And then just talk briefly about some tips for reporting progress on goals. And at the end, we'll have a Q&A. So, but you're also welcome to raise your hand if you want, or unmute at any point to ask a question as we go, or use the chat box as well. So let's jump right in. To make sure we're all on the same page as far as terminology, I just wanted to say quickly about what is an outcome. So an outcome is a change in condition, behavior, knowledge, skill, achievement that occurs as a result of exposure to a program or service. So it really is that change that we're looking for. That's what makes it an outcome. And when we talk about why we measure outcomes, first one that comes to top of mind for you all and for program staff is definitely to get funded. If you think sort of 20 years ago, it was possible to apply for funding and sort of win over funders with really a great description of your program and all the good work you're going to do and get the funding, and that would be the end of it. It's really not the case anymore. It's very rare to find that. Most funders, they want to see where their money is going, what has happened, what has changed as a result of this funding. So it's really to measure the outcomes. We want to find out whether or not that change has occurred, that your program was intended to affect. If we go one step further and talk about why we evaluate, then we're really looking at to find out how and why the change has occurred, not just whether or not it did, but how and why, so that we can use that information to encourage continuous quality improvement of programs. So with my work with different, sorry, I think we have one, just gonna mute, okay. By working with different development departments and grant writers over the years, there's a common process that I have seen of how grant writing can happen, especially in terms of evaluation and then trying to measure outcomes. And it looks something like this. So you start with identifying program goals. In order to apply for the grant, you apply, grant is awarded, the program is operated, and then near the end, there's sort of a frantic collection of data, anything you can find, trying to piece it together in order to produce that end of grant report. This clearly is not fun for anyone. It's stressful for the grant writer as you're trying to pull things together and prove to the funder that their money has gone to good use. It's stressful for program staff if they feel like they're being asked for information that they didn't know that they were supposed to collect. If there is any evaluation staff or team, they can be frustrated that they're only pulled in at the end of the process to try to sort of work magic with numbers instead of being involved from the beginning. I don't know if this looks familiar to everybody. I think especially in smaller nonprofits, you know, where obviously funds are scarce. So ideally, I would add a few more steps to this process. After identifying the program goals initially, designing a measurement plan is really an important step. And that step is before you apply for the grant. So it might seem at first that this would be kind of a waste of time. If you go through the extent of designing a whole plan of how you can measure everything, you may not get the grant. However, if you do spend that time and really develop a good measurement plan, the program, even if you're applying for a different grant, you can likely use that same measurement plan or similar on another grant. So putting time and investment into kind of really looking at what are good tools, how often are you going to collect information, where is it going to go, that will pay off even if you don't get that specific grant. In addition, if you wait until after the grant is awarded, what can happen sometimes is that you can find out that that wonderful outcome that you put into your application actually isn't measurable. Either it's not possible or it's not realistic. And then you're having to maybe go back to the funder and sort of ask for an amendment perhaps before you even started the program. So it's really thinking it through all the way to the end before you commit yourself to that in an application. Then the next step would be to set up those data collection systems and train staff. And having this really set up on day one, I mean, sometimes I understand you get funding maybe for a program that's already running, but any kind of training or orientation that's needed for a new line of funding, having data collection and evaluation sort of talked about at that point is really key for program staff to see it as a part of their job and not sort of an add-on, maybe after the program has been up and running for a few months, and then all of a sudden they have to add something new to their job, which is doing data collection. So to see it as integral to the program. Then you begin program operation, ideally review the data regularly, make changes as needed in response, and then finally report on goals at the end. Now, those two other steps that I put in about reviewing data and making changes, those are not essential. I mean, you could, even if you get the first few steps, get everything in order, operate the program, you could collect data all the way to the end and then report. The thing about that is that you're collecting the data anyway. So it really makes sense. And obviously, as an evaluator, I would encourage you to look at that data regularly. You're collecting it anyway. If you look at it regularly, you might see trends or issues or flag things that you could course correct before you get to the end. If you wait until the very end and it's time to report, the data may not look as you expected it to, and then you're having to try to explain that in a report. Whereas if you really start getting in the habit of looking at it on an ongoing basis, it not only will help you be better prepared for the end report, but you can learn along the way and hopefully use that information to improve the program as it goes. I'm going to pause there. I feel like I'm talking quickly. Any questions so far? Okay. Keep going. So now we get into kind of the step of designing your goals. As far as terminology, I'm going to use goal, could refer to either an outcome, which is a change, as I discussed, or an output, which is more simply a count of an activity. So a goal for a program, for example, could be to serve 75 participants. That's still a valid goal. It's just not an outcome. It's more of an output, just counting that activity. People may also use the term objective, goal. They're kind of interchangeable as long as we're clear what we're talking about. And so in order to identify those goals, if time allows, I would strongly suggest that you use some type of program mapping process, which sometimes is called a logic model or theory of change, to identify those outputs and outcomes. So this is something that would have to be done for the program as a whole, not really just for one particular grant application. It should be something that the that's done for the entire program. This can be a time-intensive process. It should be a little bit if it's done correctly. There should be a series of brainstorming sessions, inclusion of a variety of stakeholders to get input from different people. But it really can pay off to have that clear map of exactly what the program is doing, why, and sort of the connection, why you think that that is going to lead to a certain outcome, to make sure that that's all clear. Here is a very basic template that I've used in the past for a logic model. If you Google logic models, you'll get, a million different maps. You can do it in 100 different ways, but they should include these key sort of elements of inputs, activities, outputs, and outcomes. Now, I want to talk about SMARTY goals, which may be a new term to some of you. It was actually a new term to me until recently. You probably have all heard of SMART goals, but I'm going to go through each one as well. Even if you have heard them, it really is a useful framework, I think, when you're trying to develop any kind of goals. And then the IE, to make it into SMARTY goals, that was coined by the Management Center. It's a relatively recent addition to encourage organizations to be more inclusive and equitable in their development of goals. So I'll go through them one by one. So the S stands for specific. So you want to ask yourself if the goal is clear with enough detail and focus to really be understood, and then also to move on to measurement. So you want it to be measurable. Is it possible for the grantee to measure this goal? Both, possible as far as the sort of ability of the program, and are there measurement tools to sort of think that through? Achievable, is it reasonable that this goal could be achieved by this specific program? So not just sort of the area, but the way that your program is designed, is operated. Is that a reasonable goal? Relevant, is the goal directly related to the grantee program, which sounds kind of obvious, but sometimes I think if there's an application to maybe a slightly different funding source that's a little bit outside of your current program, I think goals can sometimes be pulled off track a little bit. So really to make sure that it's still clearly connected to the program. Time bound, there should be a clear time frame. So it's not just a general goal, but by this time, this is exactly what we hope to achieve. Then the I, which is inclusive, and that's looking at, does this goal intentionally seek to include into decision-making roles those who have been traditionally excluded? And the last one is equitable. Does this goal seek to address systemic inequity? So as far as the first five, the SMART, the SMART acronym, you really should be able to answer a clear yes to each one of these to ensure that the goals that you're developing are of good quality. As far as the IE, you may not be able to answer yes to every one of your goals unless perhaps the focus of the program is to address issues of equity. But I would say that ideally you should have at least one goal that could say yes, that could have an answer of yes to these last two indicators here. Or perhaps you look at it more generally at the program, maybe not for each individual goal, but you look at the program and ask these questions if these are things that are being addressed. So I do think it's still very useful to keep it in this type of checklist, to kind of keep it on in the forefront of everyone's mind as new goals and new programs are being developed. So the sort of flip side now of that was the general framework that we're looking at to develop. Oh, sorry, I see your raised hand, so I'm gonna pause for a second. Go ahead, Laura.
Hi, I just had a question. The bottom of the screen is a little bit cut off. I just wanted to get the source of the SMARTY.
Oh, yes, sorry about that. Oh, so you can't see down?
I mean, I can just see the top of it on my monitor.
Oh, okay, sorry, it's the Management Center.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, managementcenter.org. You're welcome. Hopefully nothing else is cut off, but do let me know if that happens. Okay, so we have the framework of what we're looking for high quality goals. So the kind of the flip side of that is I just want to point out some common pitfalls of things I've seen over the years in reviewing various goals. So they fall into major categories. One is lack of clarity. Under that, combining more than one outcome or output into one goal. This happens sometimes, and it sort of muddies what you're looking at. For example, if you said students in an after-school program will improve their math and ELA. But then what happens if half of the students improve in only math and half improve in only ELA? Technically, nobody met the goal, but that's not really what happens. There was still progress. So I would always recommend separating those so that you can clearly really represent what's happened. Including too many goals overall, less can be more. I think sometimes I've seen some contracts where there are 20 plus goals that were put into an application, and it's, it can sometimes just muddy the waters, really. I don't think that that's necessarily impressive or to a funder. I think that sometimes fewer goals, but that are really carefully crafted, that really represent what the intention is and what you're hoping to achieve, can be just as impactful as a long list of goals. Being too descriptive, aiming for simple language is really important. A goal should not be a paragraph long with multiple sentences. That's more of the narrative about the program, but the goal really should be sort of short and to the point. And including goals that are not closely related to the program, which I sort of touched on earlier and can happen sometimes. The other bucket is sort of lack of planning around measurement. So being unrealistic or lofty, especially related to time frame, can often happen. It's important to be lofty in your mission, but not really in your goals. The goals should be grounded and quite realistic related to your program. Not including a target for achievement is another one. By not including the target, it's hard to see whether you or not you have succeeded if there wasn't sort of a threshold that was set at the beginning. And then placing undue data collection burden on programs. So sometimes, again, not anyone's intention, but if the step of measurement isn't thought through at the beginning, you may end up committing to something that when it gets translated to the ground, it turns out that that's going to be an enormous burden and sort of not outweighed by the importance of the goal. Perhaps there is something, that's going to take more effort, but it really is just going to be so key to the program. But you have to weigh those two things. Then just a few tips on kind of checking or reviewing once you think you have some good goals developed. Just asking the simple question of, was the goal met? You should be able to say yes or no without sort of a long description. If you need too many qualifiers, well, it depends, it was partial, then it's really not clear enough. There certainly is always room for elaboration on the yes or no. I'm not saying that it should be that simple, but you should be able to say yes or no. That just helps to turn it around and show you that it is a clear and direct goal. Using the checklist for the SMART or SMARTY indicators, as I listed before, you could have a simple spreadsheet, have your goals down the side and the SMART across the top, and really just go through and check, deliberately think about each one of them for each goal. It wouldn't take very long, but kind of a useful tool. And I'd recommend using a table to map out a measurement plan, just something simple like I have here, looking at the goal, identifying the measurement tool, sort of the collection plan, who or when, time frame, and then maybe a lead team member. So some variation on this. The idea is just to get this information written down somewhere and sort of agreed on with whoever is going to be collecting and managing that information, to just so there's no surprises, to get it established. It may not be required by the grant application, but very strongly recommended to have that in place. It'll force you to think it through beginning to end. And if funding allows, work with an evaluation consultant. And I'm not just saying that because I am an evaluation consultant. You may have, if you have evaluation staff already on your team, excellent, include them as early as possible and as much as they're willing to be included. It's definitely a team effort, I think, to develop these goals. And even if there is short on funding, you wouldn't have to engage an evaluation consultant necessarily to be involved in the whole grant from beginning to end, but even if you could have someone get 2 or 3 hours of their time to look through your application or look through your goal matrix or whatever you have and give you some feedback, even just for a few hours could potentially really pay off later on, because they can flag up these type of questions. Did you think about this? How's that going to work? Just that sort of sounding board, I would recommend as well, if possible. Okay, any questions at this point? All right, now we're gonna get into the fun stuff, which is examples. So what I'm gonna do is, I tried to come up with some examples from a range of program areas to hopefully have it be relevant. It's partially relevant to everyone. I'm gonna start with the not so great examples and kind of talk about the things about it that would flag, kind of red flags for me, and then show you maybe a different example that might be a bit improved. So we'll start with education. An example goal might be students will demonstrate improvement in math after participation in an 8-week tutoring program. On the surface, sounds okay, seems pretty clear about what the intention is there. My first question would be which students? So there's no number there, there's no target. So the inference then would be that all students that attend are going to improve in math 100%, essentially, because you're not saying a percentage. Which, you know, depending on the program, it could be the case. Maybe it's a very intensive program and they expect every single student to show improvement. But just if not, that's something to think about. Also, participation in an 8-week tutoring program. What if students only come twice? You know, two weeks out of the 8 weeks, are they counted? Are you going to look at their improvement? Do you want to set that threshold as well? So things like that. So another alternative, just to put in a bit more clarity, would be 90% of students who attend at least 75% of the tutoring sessions will demonstrate improvement in math. Again, that's not the only way you can do it. This is just one example of how you might want to add a bit more detail in there, so it's clear what exactly the goal is, so that you're not trying to figure that step out at the end. Another example, mental health. Participants will report increased self-esteem and will have a clean drug test 2 months after discharge. Again, nothing wrong with this overall, but one thing that it does, which I mentioned before, is a common pitfall. It's combining 2 different outcomes here in one. So you have the increased self-esteem and then you have the clean drug test. So those, I would separate those out so there's no confusion about who you're measuring for what. And this also is 2 months after discharge, which again, depending on the program, that may not be a big burden. Perhaps there is an aftercare program, perhaps there's a great outreach team. If not, following up after discharge can sometimes be a huge challenge and can be a huge time burden on staff. So just thinking through, depending on the program, is that reasonable or is that going to be a really heavy lift? So an alternative would be participants will report increased self-esteem at the end of the 6-month counseling program. So it's only looking at self-esteem and it's looking at the point of discharge rather than doing the follow-up. And then an example for environment. Household recycling will increase in X town by the end of the grant cycle. So some of my questions here would be, what does it mean by increase? Are we looking at the number of households in the town? You want to increase the number of households, or perhaps the amount of recycling that each household produces? Maybe you want that to increase. So just being clear about how exactly that's being thought of. So an example would be the number of households in X town that put out recycling to be collected at least twice a month will increase by 10% at the end of the cycle. It's just adding a bit more context, a bit more information, so there's no confusion either by the funder or when it comes down to reporting, you sort of aren't going back and saying, what did we mean by this? What did we want? What exactly did we want to look at? Now, you could make the argument that the initial environment example here would be fine as long as the additional information as far as how you were defining increase is written down somewhere else in a measurement plan, for example. So perhaps this first example is what's included in the application. And then you have another document internally that's going to explain exactly how you're defining it, how it's going to be measured, where you're going to get this information from. So it doesn't necessarily have to all be in the outcome, I guess is what I'm saying, as long as it's somewhere. If you put it in the outcome, great, there's no question because it's all there in one place. If you want to have it somewhere else and keep the outcome that goes into the application simpler, that's fine too. It's just making sure you have that information. Is this making sense to most people? I'm not seeing any. Okay, seeing thumbs up. That's good. I can't see everybody. So, okay, then hopefully I'll get some people that are feeling brave, because I'd like to open this up to some participation if anyone is willing. So I have a few more examples here, and I was going to put up the not so great example, and I'm just curious to hear what people might say, what questions might you have, or what about it do you think maybe could be improved? So for housing, I have, due to the recent increase in homelessness and lack of affordable housing in X town, our team will deliver outreach services to individuals on the street and attempt to connect them to ongoing support services. So anyone have any thoughts about what about this may not be great? What could be improved? What questions do you have? You can use the chat box as well. Oh, sorry, I see there are some. Oh, yeah, you can just unmute, you can chat, whatever, and whatever you feel comfortable with.
I don't see this as a goal at all.
Yep, that's right, absolutely. It's essentially, it sounds great. It sounds wonderful. You're sort of like, you know, this
It's
great
an
program.
activity, right?
Yes. Yes, it's saying generally why it has a little bit of need in there and a little bit of what's going to be done. But there's no, right, there's no numbers, there's no how many individuals, you know, what kind of support services, how there's really, it's lacking detail and certainly not measurable. There's nothing in there that's measurable. That's absolutely right. So I would something, I mean, another option, just something very simple. Our outreach team will speak to 100 homeless individuals by the end of the grant cycle. So I think, but this is it's an easy trap to fall into, because sometimes outcomes, I don't know, can sound, people think of almost of impact, or kind of like, what is the big picture? What is the big, large thing we want to achieve, and why are we doing it? And you kind of end up with language that's very sort of lofty like this, but not really saying something specific that can be measured. For food insecurity, increased reach of our food bank will ensure that no one in X town feels food insecure. Any concerns or questions about this one? Anything you would?
That's not realistic.
I would agree. Unless your town has maybe 10 people in it, then likely to say that no one, you know, 100% of people in your town will no longer feel food insecure is quite lofty and quite difficult to measure, again, depending how big your town is. You know, it's a great mission. It's a great something to strive for, but something that's more measurable could be increased reach of our food bank will allow us to serve 50 additional families each year of the grant. And that, you know, that still is very valid goal. I think it's easy to get carried away sometimes with wanting things to sound very grand and sound very impactful, because obviously you're asking for money, but balancing that. And a lot of this other language can be, you know, in the application and in the need section and in, you know, different parts of the application narrative, but really trying to keep it separate from the goals. And the last example, 75% of youth in our intensive theater program will go on to careers in the theater arts industry. Any thoughts about this one? It does say it's intensive, but any concerns, any thoughts of how this might be improved?
Again, that's very lofty. They're going on to a career from being a youth. There's a whole lot of things that happen in between there, like other training, or maybe they're seeking higher education or further training to pursue a career. But to say that they're going to go into the careers is very, very lofty.
Absolutely. I agree.
Also,
Yes.
the time frame that it would take to be able to report that back could be,
Yes.
years and years.
Decades.
So, yeah.
Yes, this would be a major follow-up study, which again, perhaps it's a very well-funded program, maybe they could do that, but likely it's going to be quite challenging. So you could say something like 75% of youth who graduate from our intensive theater program will indicate a strong interest in pursuing a career in theater arts, and you can do a survey or something at the end of the program. So even if that is your goal, that they do that, but you're trying to look at a way to make it measurable, still impactful, but something that's reasonable. So I'm just seeing some more.
Can I ask a question, Nora?
Absolutely.
For a while, we were all writing, like, at the end of these, we'd write as evidenced by a survey, blah, 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 or evidenced by self-reporting or whatever. Are people really getting away from that, you think?
No, not necessarily. I was trying to keep these a bit more succinct sort of for the example, but that can absolutely be indicated within the outcome or the goal itself, or as I said, in maybe another section that explains your measurement tools or how all these things will be measured. Yeah, so whether it could definitely be within the same goal itself or somewhere else. Any other questions about these, or anyone that feels like they're in a completely different area that these didn't really cover, and you have more questions? Okay, and I'll keep moving. Okay, so measurement tools, as Laura brought us into. So that really is the next step that you should be need to think about while you're thinking through goals and trying to finalize how exactly they're going to be worded and what's going to be measured. So there's sort of two main areas, main types of data that you'll likely be looking at when we're talking about measurement. There's quantitative data, which is numeric and can be collected, or the tools you use can vary from surveys, which either may be standardized or locally developed. So if the program is operating in some type of a research-based, evidence-based practice, then there may be a standardized tool that goes along with that practice that would definitely be the go-to if that's available, to use that type of tool to measure and collect data. Or it can be locally developed. There's nothing wrong with that, especially if it's a unique program or a pilot or something, and that needs to be developed specific to that program. You may have program activity records, the attendance, observations, it's where all the spreadsheets come in. So that's activity that's being recorded directly by the program. You may also request third-party data. So if it is an after-school program and you want to approach the school for test scores or grades for those students, perhaps medical data, if that is relevant to the program. There's also quite a wide range of publicly available data, if that's, again, useful or relevant to the program as far as school districts or cities or towns. And then you have qualitative data, which is more descriptive. So you can also use surveys sometimes for qualitative data, and then very often focus groups or interviews can get you that really more in-depth and detailed feedback. And as far as the type of information you're likely will be measuring, there's participant satisfaction, which is always useful. Really, it doesn't necessarily get to that change in behavior, but it can give you useful information about the program itself, the sort of user experience, and what may be kept or changed based on that feedback. There's the program usage and dosage, which is, gets back to that sort of attendance, observation, looking at who is coming, how much, when, what is their dosage of the program. And then the outcomes, the change in behavior, attitude, skills, which again can be measured, again, by the surveys or test scores, medical data, things like that. And then we need to talk about where all that data will be held. So this, as far as the measurement and data collection systems, this could definitely be its own entire presentation. So I'm not going into depth here, but just some basic tips. Avoid paper and pencil if at all possible, which I'm sure you all are familiar with. When it comes to the end, you're trying to compile and analyze data, and you're getting lots of written, handwritten things, which not only can sometimes be illegible, but then you also need to usually get that into some type of an electronic system. So data entry. So if at all possible, if it can go directly into something electronic from the beginning, that's ideal. Only record what you need, not necessarily what would be nice to know. When I've assisted different programs with developing even sort of simple data collection tools or Excel sheets or what have you, it's easy to get carried away, especially if it's something new, and it's great when people are excited about wanting to record the activities that they do and wanting to see things. But if you sort of go too far to one extent, first of all, you often don't use all of that data if you're trying to record absolutely everything. And it can make the data collection tool very cumbersome and overwhelming, and then people don't use it. So it's often better to ideally pinpoint really the essential information you need, keep the tool as simple as possible, making data entry or collection as easy as possible, so you'll get quality data, even if it's a less volume. And as far as where you can collect and store data, obviously Excel, trusty Excel is always at the top of everyone's list. Also Google Sheets now, and Google Forms are excellent for doing surveys, because then the results go straight into a Google Sheet for analysis. They also can output some nice, just off the shelf kind of graphs and things for you. An Access database would be kind of a step up, but that does require someone who has some knowledge of that program. It's a Microsoft program, and how to set that kind of system up. There's Airtable or other online database options that are sort of branded as no code databases that are they're sort of point and click, very user friendly to set up. So someone who doesn't have as much, don't necessarily need expertise to set that up. So that's something else to explore. And then sort of your top level would be some type of a CRM system, such as Salesforce, some type of database system, but that clearly does require an investment in money for sure, as well as time in getting that type of system set up. And then
Nora, I'm curious, when the organizations you work with, what do you find people use the most? I'm curious.
It depends on the size of the organizations. I mean, larger, well-funded organizations will have some type of a CRM or some type of a database product, for sure, especially if there are multiple programs and you need to collect information, across multiple sites. If the funding is there, that's definitely common. For everyone else, I'd say Excel and Google is what I see most often, especially for smaller operations. And Google Sheets, especially, again, if multiple people need to access it, you're not sending files back and forth since it's web-based. So yeah, I would say those are kind of, it's almost either end of the spectrum, so it probably most common. All right, and then I just wanted to touch briefly on reporting, although happy for more questions around this, as I know there was some talk about reports being due around now. So these are, again, just a few sort of tips. It's common sense, I guess, but if more work is done up front, then the reporting should be smoother at the end. So I think it is easy to, after so much work goes into the application and then you get the grant, and then it just, everything sort of can move quickly. The contract comes and people have to be hired and things have to happen, and you need to get it off the ground. As it was mentioned earlier, program is supposed to start January 1st and the funding still hasn't come through. Everything is always kind of behind, but to really ensure that the work, the evaluation work, the identifying goals, measurement systems, getting all that set up really needs to be seen as essential in that busy, crazy process. Because if not, you're just going to pay for it on the other end as it gets closer to reporting and you realize that something wasn't collected or things were never quite set up as they should be. So doing that work up front will relate to the reporting at the end. Including simple graphs or tables is always welcome in reports. That's certainly easier said than done. As Allison mentioned, I love data visualization. I love graphics and visual representations, but it's not easy. It can often take time to get it right, even can take time to make something simple, especially to make sure it's clearly understood and, can be understood by a wide audience. But if you have anybody on your team who sort of specializes in that or has a knack for that, it can both, break up the narrative visually as well as really communicate some great information that doesn't quite come across the same in a narrative. The red, yellow, green system to identify goal status. So this is just a real simple sort of table that I've seen used to great effect, which is to just list the goals, and then in whatever time frame you're reporting for, use kind of a however you want to present it, but sort of a visual color system of goal was met, goal not met, or maybe something in the middle, progress made towards goal. And then certainly have notes and narrative to explain in more detail. We never want it to be this simple of a just yes met, no not met. That leaves a lot of questions. You would want to clearly communicate if it was met, by how much, what is the percentage, and talk about those successes. If it wasn't met, what were the challenges? What did you see as, the issues, and why did you not get to that goal? If substantial progress was made, even if you didn't hit that 75% mark, but this is all the progress that's made, this is how we're moving closer. Again, if you have been looking at the data throughout the year or throughout the time frame and not just at the end, you could say, that this is what we saw, and these are the corrections we made, and this is what's changed, and to give real context to that. But overall, just to use this type of table, then the funder or the reader is not searching through paragraphs of narrative to try to figure out actually how are you doing or how did it go. It really puts it out there in clear terms, and then you can add all the context as needed in narrative. I would talk about how data is used throughout the grant cycle, which I just touched on. Obviously you have to actually do it in order to talk about it, but if you are doing it, if the program is doing it, I think that's a huge, something to put out there and to make sure that your funder knows that it's happening. Again, just evaluation in general and data monitoring is very, is important and is seen as sort of, seen as important. So to highlight that, if it's being done, how are you using it? Who's meeting? What kind of stakeholders is it being shared with, and what's happening once that data is looked at and discussed. And then also just to put out there that that things change, and you can always ask for, well, I shouldn't say that always, sorry, I'm not the funder. It is worth trying, I think, to ask for a goal amendment if it's needed, especially if it's a multi-year, contract, and at the end of year one, it's clear that one of the goals, even though it was very well designed and well measured, is just not happening. It's some, or obviously COVID, something changed, and to not be afraid to approach funders. Again, no guarantee, your funders best. But well, actually, somebody mentioned earlier before the presentation that someone had said about a funder having to chase down a grantee for a report, and that seems like, wow, that would never happen. So I do think that sometimes funders are more understanding than we realize, or because, and I say we, thinking of myself, in a nonprofit as a receiver of funds, there's this feeling that they hold the purse strings, they sort of hold all the power, and we don't want to admit that something's not going to plan, or admit that something is just not quite right. But I have seen it happen. Let me say that funders have been approached and have granted amendments that have been reasonable and understanding to a certain situation that has required goals to change for some reason. So perhaps you all have a different experience, but I just wanted to put that out there to not be afraid of exploring that as a possibility. And my time, I think that was, so that's all that I had. I feel like I did a lot of talking, and I am thankful, though, appreciate people who jumped in with their recommendations when we were looking at the examples. yeah, I'd like to open it up to any questions.
Just unmute and speak up. Thank you so much, Laura. That was great. And Nora, let's stop the screen share, in fact, maybe. And then, yeah. Great.
Just want to say thank you. Very, very clear and especially useful for everything, but especially federal grants. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. I'm glad to hear that. It's hard to know such a wide range of attendees here that I'm glad. I hope that it was helpful to everybody in some way. And it's hard for me. There's so many areas here again that could be set. You could go way farther in depth, logic models, theories of change, that could be a whole thing. Data systems could be a whole thing. Surveys, designing surveys and good survey questions. So yeah, I'm glad that it was helpful.
Something that you touched on, Nora, at the end that I think we all sometimes forget is that our funders are partners and not just, just deep pockets, right? So
Yes.
especially our foundation partners, I think I think at our last Meet the Funders, they actually said, like, talk to us, tell us if you're struggling, tell us if something's happening. Those conversations are important, so.
Yeah, I agree. It is good to look at them as partners. I mean, they want you to succeed as much as you do, right? It's to their benefit that the program comes out, that some impact has happened. So if they can help facilitate that by helping you shift something, it would make sense that they would be open to that.
I know you mentioned like don't have 20, 25 different goals that you think you're going to meet, but do you have a guideline of what you think is the right number?
That's a good question. I mean, I know some applications may have a requirement, so it may not even be your choice. I'd also say it would probably depends on the size of the program. And I was going to say the amount of funding, but maybe not necessarily, because I wouldn't say even if it's $1 million contract, I wouldn't say that you should have 20 goals. I don't think it's relative that way. I mean, I would say 5 to 7, maybe. Actually, I guess it depends. It depends how many outcomes and outputs maybe you're looking at. There may be, just thinking about the size of the program. If there are maybe 4 or 5 outputs, maybe you'd want to have an additional 5 outcomes. I'm not sure. That's not a clear answer, but yeah, I'd say no more than 10 is sort of my gut reaction to that. Again, just because it can sort of go on, and it doesn't. I think also the idea that you have to measure or demonstrate every single effect that the program could possibly have, or like every single activity that you do is not necessarily. You can track that internally, absolutely. You should sort of track and measure as much as sorry, I thought I lost connection there for a minute.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, that you can. Oh, someone said they aim for 3 to 5 goals. Yeah, I think that's absolutely fine. I think looking again, if you start with some type of a project map or a logic model, and you identify everything that's important to the program internally to track and look at and review on a regular basis, then you can select from that what you want to put into an application or into a grant. I wouldn't say once you identify everything that's important to the program that you put all of those into a contract. I think so. I would be selective about, first of all, what's most important to the funder. If they have a certain focus, I would select which ones are most relevant. Yeah, and you can always add more in a narrative if more great things happen, but if you're promising, I'd sort of promise less the things that you really think you can achieve and you think, will be, I mean, we'll also show important and useful information, but almost commit yourself to less and you can always share more if needed. I hope that makes sense. Is there a question in the chat? Oh.
I had a quick question.
Mhm.
You had mentioned public data sources, and I always like to include a lot of that background in a grant if it's relevant in terms of student learning or underserved populations. 2 things. Do you have any go-to sources for that besides, census data or school departments? And the second question is, how current does it have to be? Can it be maybe 2 or 3 years old?
Yeah, as far as sources, I don't really have any at the top of my mind. I mean, yeah, definitely school districts. Nowadays, most school districts have fairly some type of like report card, if you will, that will show some key information, and that's definitely become even more accessible online and even sort of in a, in better formats. I think, yeah, I mean, locale, obviously New York City would have multiple, sources, different departments. And yeah, I think the more, and right, national census data, I think kind of obviously the more local you can get, the more relevant it is. As far as how recent, I feel like you're really stuck with what you can get. So, and I think that funders understand that, especially wide, what data collection processes like a census or even city or statewide is usually going to be not collected that often, and then also like a delay in when that's available. So yeah, I would say within the last, oftentimes you can only get something in the last few years. And again, if you say that's the latest information available, that's all you can do.
Thank you.
Welcome. I think somebody was giving some suggestions for data. Thank you. There's some
Yeah,
links in the
sorry,
chat.
that giant link that I just posted, that if you're in Westchester County, the Westchester Women's Agenda just published a 107-page report. That's the 2022 report on the status of women in Westchester.
Wow.
There's a lot of metrics and great information in there, so enjoy.
Thank you. I did see that. I'll check it out again.
I'm a little further north in Dutchess, but I use the Mid-Hudson Valley Community Profiles pretty often, and the Alice report from United Way, the one of New York State, is pretty good. So we should share these, you guys.
Yeah,
We should
thanks
do like
someone-
a membership database sharing, because I bet everybody has one, like their go-to data sites, and we're all data nerds, right? So
That's a
Yeah.
great idea. That's a
Yes.
great idea.
Yeah, so someone mentioned in the chat as well, the Department of Education, What Works Clearinghouse best practices. That's great for sure. And there are several different sort of things like that, as mentioned earlier, evidence-based programs or tools, measurement tools and things like that. It's a very sort of buzzword, I would say, and important to, if that applies to your program, to be aware of those. Any other questions?
I think this was great. Thank you so much. It was clear. I love the visuals. I'd never thought of doing a goal met red, green, yellow chart, but that certainly communicates effectively, and you were so clear throughout. So I think this is going to be downloaded and viewed many, many times. I'm going to stop the recording and just say thank you so very, very much. Reminding everybody, we will send out, how do I stop the recording? There we go. Sorry.